If you want to see some awesome fish, you're really going to enjoy this video. This is the beginner's guide to Lake Tanganyika cichlids. These are great cichlids that, one, are not super aggressive. A lot of them stay smaller, so you can put them in smaller aquariums. If you've got a little bit of fish keeping experience, just about anybody can keep these fish. Now, I am going to break up the Lake Tanganyika cichlids into what I would call relatively non-scientific groups. We're going to talk about shell dwellers. We're going to talk about rock dwellers. We're going to talk about the open water swimmers. And at the end, we're going to talk about some of the fish that are a little bit more predatory, even though they're not all that aggressive. One thing to keep in mind with the Lake Tanganyika fish, they do like harder water with a higher pH. And so if you're someone who's got a pH of around 8 or even to 8.3 or 4, and your water hardness is approaching the double digits or more, this might be the fish for you. Again, the way we categorize it, the way I did, it's not necessarily scientific. It's really there so that you can understand the different types of Lake Tanganyika fish. And I promise you, by the time you get done with this video, you're going to know a lot more. And if you want more information on the fish we talk about in this video, we've got tons of species profiles for you in the description below. Hope you enjoy the video. Appreciate you being here. All right, so the first group of fish I think we should be talking about are the shell dwellers. These are often the easiest fish to keep if you are a new fish keeper to Lake Tanganyika fish. And the reason for that is, one, they are usually going to be very small. So most of the shell dwellers are going to max out at just a couple inches or so, maybe even less for a lot of them. Some of the really popular ones are Neolamprologus multifasciatus, otherwise known as the multis. You have Neolamprologus similis. Then you have the Neolamprologus brevis, Lamprologus ocellatus, Calypterus, Meleagris. These are all really good examples, and there are lots of other shell dwellers as well. And we've kept most of them. I would say of the shell dwellers, if you're just getting in the Lake Tanganyika fish, the multis and the similis are the two easiest to keep. I would say the brevis are a pretty close third. Some of the other ones can be a little bit more aggressive, but for the most part, these are all fish that people who have been into fish keeping for a little while, they should be able to manage these types of fish. So the shell dwellers are great, one, because they have awesome personality. And so they've got all that cichlid personality just wrapped up into a smaller package where they are going to be interacting with you, interacting with one another. And I think that's what makes them so interesting as you watch them in an aquarium, and they have their own way to communicate, and they never get boring to look at. The other cool thing is most shell dwellers are going to do just fine in a 20-gallon or greater. We keep a lot of shell dwellers in standard 20 gallons and 20-gallon longs. They're also really fun to breed, especially the multis and the similis and the brevis. They will breed fairly readily, and so it's kind of cool to see the little tiny fry as they develop over time. And it's always interesting when you have fish that are born in your aquarium and you can see them grow up and live out their whole lives in your fish tank. And so that's something that's a little bit unusual, but with the cichlids and particularly the shell dwellers, that can be a lot of fun. The other nice thing about the shell dwellers is you're not usually going to have an overwhelming amount of aggression. While they will have some territorial displays, usually it doesn't result in any fish being damaged or anything like that, like some of the other cichlids will. Now, again, I've already mentioned the multis and the similis. Both of those are outstanding options. Once you have a more established tank and once you have some more experience, the gold ocellatus can be a lot of fun. Meleagris can be a lot of fun as well. Now, there are some things to consider with the shell dwellers. One, if you like a really well aquascaped aquarium, this is probably not the fish for you. They are going to move shells around. They are going to move sand around. And so just expect that you're going to have little mountains of sand everywhere. Also, if you like larger fish, the shell dwellers for the most part stay really small. And so if you're going to be keeping larger fish, sometimes the shell dwellers will go missing because they get eaten. Also, one thing to keep in mind with your shell dwellers, as the name implies, they breed in shells and feel very comfortable with shells. And so when you're setting up your aquarium, that's pretty much what you need. You need a tank. You need some sand for sure, because these are fish that love to move sand around. You're going to need some shells. I highly recommend at least 1 or 2 shells per shell dweller. 2 is probably on the safer side. If you want to add some rocks, that's really great as well. That'll help them feel more comfortable, give them some more structure. That way, if you do have some males that are sparring for territory, if you've got some rocks in between their territories, that can cut down on some of the potential aggression. Like I said, usually that's minor. Now, the rock dwellers are the next group of fish I want to talk about. If you are thinking about a Lake Tanganyika aquarium, these are awesome fish. Examples would be the Julidochromis ornatus. You can see here they've got that really pretty yellow and black. Julidochromis transcriptus, they've got this kind of checkerboard look to them. Neolamprologus leylupi, this is one of the most colorful of the smaller Lake Tanganyikan fish. One of the critiques of Lake Tanganyika fish is a lot of them tend to have more of a tan or a silver or a brown coloration. Even though there's a lot of iridescence, these fish are absolutely going to add some color. The Neolamprologus caudopunctatus, otherwise known as the caudopunx, and of course the Tropheus I include in this group of the rock dwellers. Again, we're not necessarily making scientific groupings here, but really groupings based on that's going to be helpful for the hobbyist. So with the rock dwellers, they are awesome because, again, just like our shell dwellers, they're going to stay on the smaller side. Now, they're not going to be as small as the shell dwellers. A lot of them will get to around 3 or 4 inches or so. Again, tank size, you're still looking at around a 20-gallon aquarium. So, again, we don't need a really large aquarium for keeping cichlids. The other nice thing is these fish are generally easy to breed. Are they as easy to breed as some of the shell dwellers? Not necessarily. And keep in mind, if you have a community tank of Lake Tanganyikan fish, some of those fry will be eaten by other inhabitants within that community, but they are still somewhat easy to breed. Setting up the aquarium is usually very simple. Again, highly recommend sand. Highly recommend a lot of rock work. As the name implies, it's going to help them feel a lot more comfortable, give them territory, and especially if you want them to breed, they're usually going to be cave spawners, and they're usually quite secretive. You're not generally going to see the eggs. Eventually, you're just going to see little tiny baby rock dwellers peeking out from behind the rocks, and some of the spawns can be quite large. It's not unusual to have somewhere between 20 and 50 little tiny rock dwellers swimming around your aquarium. And again, one of the awesome things about these fish is they are going to potentially show more color. Just like the shell dwellers, I wouldn't say that they are overly aggressive, and that's why you can keep a group of a half a dozen or so in a 20-gallon. Can you mix them with the shell dwellers? Absolutely. When I mix my Lake Tanganyikan fish, I prefer to have a larger tank, such as a 40-gallon breeder or a 4-foot tank, and that just helps them, give them all their own space. That way we're not getting into any territorial issues. And if you want to breed multiple types, multiple species in the same tank, that's a lot more possible with a larger tank. Now, some of the advantages compared to the shell dwellers, I already talked about. They can be a little bit more colorful. Obviously, they're a little bit larger. Most of them are going to be more cylindrical in shape, which is pretty interesting. Just the shape in and of themselves is pretty interesting. The aggression levels, not really all that aggressive. Like I said, they're similar to shell dwellers. And the cool thing is, these guys are not going to rearrange your tank like the shell dwellers will. So they don't move the sand as much. They're not going to be diggers. I have found it's pretty easy to keep plants with my rock dwelling Lake Tanganyika cichlids, even though it's not a biotope or a biotype. I just like the way live plants look, and so I will often plant my Lake Tanganyika tanks if I've got rock dwellers, just because I like that look. Now, some things to keep in mind with your rock dwellers. Some of them would like to have a tank a little bit larger than 20 gallons, some of the larger ones. If you don't have enough rocks, sometimes the aggression will pick up a little bit. They really do like to have their own space. I always say add more rocks than you think you're going to need. And like I said, compared to the Maltese and compared to the Simlis, there might be a little bit more predation when it comes to the fry. So if you really want to keep the fry, when you start to see them, if you want to remove the fry from the tank, which is not always easy to do, that might be the way to go. One thing to keep in mind as well as we're looking at these categories in particular, the Tropheus in particular can be a little bit more aggressive than other rock dwellers that I've talked about so far. Those usually need to be kept in bigger groups, and this is one where I highly recommend at least a 75-gallon aquarium, and their diet is going to be a little bit more complicated. A lot of them would prefer to have a high vegetable matter diet. and that can be a little bit problematic, especially if you want to mix some Lake Tanganyika fish around. So that's one I would definitely prefer to keep separate, keep them on their own in a species only tank. And I would highly recommend having some fish keeping experience, having some cichlid keeping experience before doing the Tropheus. Next up on the list, and these are some of my favorite Lake Tanganyika fish. These are what I call the open water swimmers. We've talked about shell dwellers. We've talked about fish that like to hang out by rocks. These ones are fish that tend to hang out more in the open water. One of these, I would say, kind of straddles the rock dwelling and open water swimmers. But of this group, one of my favorites is the Cyprichromis species, especially Cyprichromis leptosoma. These are fish that have a very intense amount of color, some really pretty blues, some really pretty yellow. Depending on the species, you might get some different coloration. The Paracyprichromis are also very colorful, as well as the entire Ophthalmotilapia genus. A lot of those fish, the males, show striking amounts of color. Probably the most common of these in the group here is going to be Neolamprologus burchardi. This is a fish from Lake Tanganyika that can be found pretty readily, very inexpensive. The only downside to them is they love to breed like crazy, and it can actually become an issue in some Lake Tanganyika aquariums. So with the open water swimmers, you got to be a little bit careful with the burchardi. Even though they're beautiful fish, they might be a fish that really fills up your tank in a hurry. Now, these fish can range dramatically in size, anywhere from 3 or so inches up to 6, 7, or 8 inches. The other thing to keep in mind with these feather fin and open water type cichlids, they can get really expensive. I have seen some featherfin cichlids retail go from anywhere from $50 to $80 to $100 each. Now, they're not all that expensive, and obviously if you get smaller fish, they're going to be far less expensive. And I do think for the open water swimmers, one of my go-tos has always been, like I said, the Cyprichromis, just because they are a little bit expensive retail. It's not uncommon to find them anywhere from $15 to $30 a piece, but if you get a half a dozen or so, it's really going to fill up the middle part of your aquarium. These fish are easy to breed. At least the Cyprichromis are. The burchardi, extremely easy to breed. But even the Cyprichromis, really amazing little fish. And the reason for that is males have all the color. The females stay a little bit more silver. It's a fairly active fish that loves to be in the open water. They breed in the open water. Their fry are miniature versions of the adults, and the females don't have a lot of fry. Usually they're going to hold the fry in their mouth, and then they're going to spit out maybe 2, 3, 4 fry at a time. And they instantly, the males actually show a little bit of color, and they just look like mini adults, and it really is quite cute. Now with these fish, generally speaking, I do recommend at least a 40-gallon breeder, but a 4-foot tank would be even better. For the burchardi, you could get away with a 29. We used to breed them in a 29-gallon. Not really any issues there. But these fish, because they are a little bit more active than the Maltese, the shell dwellers, they're going to be more active in terms of how much they're swimming around in the open water. And so for me, that means I want at least that 55-gallon tank, or a 33 long. Some type of a 4-foot tank really would be ideal. This is a great fish if you're looking for that activity, because you've got some shell dwellers or some rock dwellers in the bottom, 25-30% of your tank. If you're looking to fill up those open waters, the feather fins and the Cyprichromis in particular are really nice options. But just keep in mind, you could be spending some money to get these fish into your aquarium. Like I said, exercise caution with the burchardi. Just want to mention that one more time, just because they do breed like crazy. They can overrun a tank. They can start getting aggressive with other fish when they're protecting fry. And with the burchardi, what happens is not only do the parents protect the fry, but so do the juveniles from that same group. And so just keep that in mind, because it could become a problem in your aquarium. And of course, setting up a tank for these fish is relatively easy. Again, with the Lake Tanganyikans, always go with sand. Because they're open water, make sure that when you're setting up an aquarium, if you've got other types of fish like shell dwellers and rock dwellers, these fish do need some open water swimming space. So just keep that in mind, not to fill up your tank completely with rocks and then not give them the space they need to swim around. Now, I would definitely put some rocks in there. I wouldn't just do an empty tank, because when the parents spit out fry, generally those fry kind of gravitate towards structure until they get large enough and feel comfortable enough and secure enough in the surroundings to be more open water swimmers like the parents are. These fish, for the most part, are not overly aggressive. Some of the featherfin males can get a little aggressive with one another, but as far as the Cyprichromis, I've kept them in large groups in tanks as small as a 40 breeder, bred them like crazy, and really didn't see a whole lot of aggression. One other thing to keep in mind with the Cyprichromis and the featherfins is they tend to grow pretty slow. So if you get them smaller, they're still going to be somewhat expensive, and it's going to take a little while for them to show some color and to really develop the fins that you're used to seeing in some of these videos. Up on the list, I like to call these my small predator Lake Tanganyikan fish. Got to be a little bit careful here. As the name implies, these are fish that will eat smaller fish. They're basically designed to do just this. A couple of the really, really nice ones, Altolamprologus compressiceps and the Neolamprologus calvus. They look very, very similar. There are some color differences between them, but their body shape is pretty much identical. The calvus tend to stay smaller, the compressiceps a little bit larger. It's not uncommon for calvus to get somewhere around 3 inches or so, males larger than females. Compressiceps might get around 4 or 5 inches. Keep in mind with these fish, of all the fish I'm talking about here today, they probably grow the slowest. One of the jokes in the cichlid keeping community is like when someone says, oh, I've got a compressiceps or a calvus that's 1.5 inches. They'll be like, how long have you had that? 10 years? So these are very slow growing fish, which could be nice because you can keep them in smaller tanks for a while. But if you're looking for something that's going to be a little bit larger or grow to their full potential, it is going to take a few years for that to happen at least. Of the two, I tend to prefer the calvus just because they do stay on the smaller side. Now, these fish, what they generally have in common is they're kind of smashed like a pancake. They're relatively flat, so they've got this tall body, but kind of a flat body as well, and they look absolutely menacing, like they're going to destroy everything in the aquarium, but it's just not so. They're really not that aggressive towards other fish. They're not all that aggressive towards one another. They're not very fast-moving fish. Their predatory nature kind of means that they stay mostly in one space. They do swim around the tank, but they're not overly active. The calvus, I would have no problem keeping them in a 20-gallon aquarium. If you've got a larger group, a 40 breeder or a 4-foot tank is better. Again, please just keep in mind, if you're going to add these fish to a community Lake Tanganyikan setup, the likelihood that you're going to see fry is greatly diminished. These fish are designed to stay in between rocks. That's why they are so flat, and they are ambush predators, and they will just wait for the fry to come in their direction, and they will gobble them up, and they are really efficient at doing that. So if you want fry, I would probably want fry from other types of fish in your tank. I would stay away from these, but they're not hard to breed, and they generally will leave their own fry alone. Now, price-wise, these can also get expensive, especially if you want larger ones, just because they do take so long to grow. So it's not unusual to see these fish at 10, actually probably closer to 15, 20, $25 a piece. There are a lot of nice varieties, but again, expensive and definitely predatory, grow slow. Last one I want to mention here, and that is what I call the large predatory Lake Tanganyikan fish. And really, there's only one that's really common, and that is the frontosa. Absolutely love this fish. This is a centerpiece type of fish. This is a fish where if you have a large aquarium, it could be awesome. And that's one of the main keys here with the frontosa. One, these are big fish with a big mouth, and fish generally will eat other fish that are smaller than they are. Anything that can fit into their mouth, they will attempt to eat. So this is not necessarily a type of fish where you're going to have a Lake Tanganyikan community tank. Is it possible in a really large tank with tons of shells and tons of rocks? Yeah, it's possible. But you are going to see a dramatic reduction in fry from other fish. So the frontosa get huge. They can max out at a foot, maybe bigger, maybe larger. The thing to keep in mind here is you're going to need a large tank because they like to be kept in groups. I would recommend at least an 8-foot aquarium. Again, these are big fish that are going to be wider bodied as well. A lot of times they will eat shell dwellers, they will eat the rock dwellers. If you're looking for fish that are going to be complementary to them, that you can keep as tank mates, you're probably looking at some of the larger feather fins. You're looking at some of the large Synodontis cats, which we really haven't talked about here today. So the stocking options are going to be limited. The other thing to keep in mind is these tend to be very slow growing fish as well. I mentioned the Calvus are slow growing. These guys are too. So just keep that in mind. There are different varieties. These are another type of fish where the colors are awesome. I mean, you've got that nice, beautiful blue, the darker blue stripes. They have different color varieties now where you start to see a little bit more yellow. You've got the black widow frontosa, which is also really pretty. But they can get expensive, especially larger ones. It's not unusual to see the frontosa retail go from anywhere from $15 to $30 a piece. And if they are larger, $50 to $100 is not unheard of. But please keep in mind, this is not a fish long-term. Again, really, even a 6-foot tank for a group is not going to be ideal long-term. Look for an 8-foot tank or larger. And if you're just getting into Lake Tanganyika fish, this is one I would just stay away from because you've got so many options. You have so many options with the shell dwellers and the rock dwellers, the Cyprochroma leptosoma. I would say if you are new to Lake Tanganyika fish and you wanted a really good stocking option for a, let's say a 4-foot tank, a 55-gallon or a 75-gallon, you could easily pick your favorite shell dweller, 1 or 2 of your favorite rock dwellers, Cyprochroma leptosoma, and really have a very interesting tank to look at. If you have a 20-gallon, you could easily take any one of the shell dwellers, any one of the rock dwellers, put a half a dozen in there, and just watch them breed and watch their community dynamics. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you are looking for more information on African cichlids, check out that African Cichlids beginner's guide we have there in the upper right-hand corner. We've got a ton of species profiles for you in the description if you want more information as well. Really appreciate you being here, and we'll see you in the next one.